Montana Territory. July 1884, the music spilled out from the open windows of the White Elk Grange Hall, lively and bright. But Margaret Pierce stood in the dirt just outside, her hands clutched tight in front of her faded skirt, eyes down. Inside, boots stomped the wooden floor and laughter rose like smoke. Lanterns lit the walls in a warm, golden glow. Women in colorful dresses spun in the arms of men with polished boots and Sunday shirts. Margaret had only ever watched from the edge. She was used to the edge. "You can help in the kitchen, Maggie," Mrs. Donner had said earlier that evening, pressing a flour-dusted apron into her hands. "Best not to stand around out front. You know how it looks." Margaret nodded, as she always did. She was 19, quiet, and orphaned since she was 12. The Donners took her in for chores and a place to sleep in the barn loft. They did not beat her, which was more than some could say. But they reminded her often in subtle ways that she was not one of them, not good enough for the floorboards of a dancing hall, not pretty enough, not rich enough. "Too poor to dance," she heard someone whisper once last year at the spring social. "She ain't got a penny to her name." She never forgot it. Her dress tonight was borrowed and a little too tight in the shoulders. Her shoes had holes in the soles. She had not been invited to dance. She never was. "Maggie," she turned fast. The voice was low, warm, male. A man stood there in the dusk, tall and sun-browned, a felt hat in his hands and a slow sort of smile stretching across his face. Not mocking, not pitying, just gentle. "Tobias Jensen," he said, offering his hand. She'd seen him before. He worked cattle up near the foothills, came down once a month for supplies or a meal. He was quiet too, often alone, maybe 25. Kind eyes. She had never spoken to him before. "I saw you standing here," he said. "Figured you might want to dance." Her heart thudded. I do not belong in there." "Why not?" She looked down. "I am too poor to dance." He frowned slightly, then stepped closer. "That is not true. You belong wherever your feet want to go." She blinked at him. "I do not know how. I can teach you," he said, and held out his hand again. "If you let me." Her fingers trembled, but she placed her hand in his. He led her up the wooden steps and through the doors. Some people turned. She felt the weight of their stares. She knew what they saw: barn girl, threadbare, no family, no money, but Tobias did not care. He walked with her straight to the middle of the floor. The fiddle music rose again. He placed one hand gently at her waist, the other guiding her fingers, and began to move with the rhythm. Slow at first, then smoother. "Watch my feet," he murmured. "Then stop watching and just feel it." She looked up at him. His eyes were locked on hers, steady and sure. He was not embarrassed. He was proud to be with her. "You are doing fine," he whispered. She smiled, small and unsure but real. They danced through 2 songs, then 3. No one interrupted. When the music paused, he leaned closer. "You want to step outside for a bit?" She nodded. Her cheeks were flushed, her chest full of something she had never felt before: lightness. He led her out the back door where the night air was cooler. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. The noise from the hall dimmed behind them. "I do not know why you picked me," she said quietly. He looked at her, serious now. "Because I saw your face the first time I came to town. You were carrying water to the Donner's house. You looked tired, but still strong. I have not stopped thinking about you since." Her breath caught. "You deserve more than what you got handed, Maggie." She swallowed hard. No one had ever said something like that to her. "I do not have anything to offer," she said. "No land, no name, nothing." He tipped his head. "I do not need any of that, just you." The door creaked behind them and someone laughed from inside. She turned toward the sound, then back to him. "You really do not care." "I care about you," he said plainly. She looked at him a long moment. Then she reached up and placed her hand gently over his heart. It beat steady beneath her palm. "No one has ever danced with me before," she whispered. "Then I am glad I was first." She smiled again, fuller this time. You might have to teach me more, he grinned. I have time. He walked her home that night, even though it was out of his way. She let her hand brush his more than once as they walked. He brushed back. When they reached the barn, she turned to him. Will you come back? Every week if you want, he said. I want. She stood on her toes and kissed him, soft and quick. He did not pull away. I will see you soon, Maggie Pierce. She nodded, stepping back inside the dark barn, heart thudding like the fiddle in her chest. She had danced. She had been seen. And for once, she believed she was allowed to want more. 3 days passed before Margaret saw him again. She was scrubbing the porch boards behind the mercantile when she heard hooves settle in the dirt road out front. The brush was stiff in her hand, her knees sore beneath her skirts, but something in her chest lifted without permission. She didn't look up right away. She didn't want to hope. Then his voice came, low and even. Maggie. She stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, heart climbing up her throat. Tobias stepped around the corner with a small paper parcel tucked under his arm and dust on his boots. His hair was wind-tossed, and the sun caught the edge of his jaw where he hadn't shaved clean. I brought you something, he said. You didn't need to. I know, he said, offering it to her. But I wanted to. She looked down at the package. It was wrapped neat with twine and stiff brown paper. She undid it carefully, her fingers cracking the folds. Inside was a square of blue calico cloth with tiny white flowers, enough for a blouse or apron. Her eyes filled without warning. I asked the lady at the store what kind of fabric women liked, he said, watching her. She said this one was cheerful. I've never owned cloth like this before, she murmured, running her thumb over the print. I figured you'd make it into something pretty. She clutched it against her chest. I don't know how to thank you. You already did, he said. When you danced with me. She looked up at him then, blinking fast. Why are you so kind to me? He didn't answer right away. He stepped to the porch edge, leaned one elbow on the rail. You ever been outside of town? Only as far as the river bend. Once. I thought maybe you'd come see the cattle pen sometime, or the ridge once the weather breaks. I've got a spare saddle horse. She hesitated. Mrs. Donner expects me to finish chores. Would she let you come if I asked proper? She might. Then I'll ask. She shook her head, almost laughing. You're not afraid of anyone, are you? I've been kicked by broncs and caught in sleet storms halfway up a canyon wall. Mrs. Donner's not likely to shake me. She smiled, full and open now, the way she never had in town. I'd like to see the ridge. I'll ride in Saturday morning, he said. Bring something you can sit a saddle in. She nodded, then lowered her voice. You don't have to keep coming back, you know. I know, he said. But I want to. Later that afternoon, she hid the cloth beneath the loose floorboard under her cot in the barn. She touched it once before letting the board fall back into place. A soft breeze stirred the hay above her. Outside, the sky turned the color of copper. That night, as she lit the lantern by the tack wall, she found herself humming the tune from the dance. Her hands worked slow, brushing the curry comb over the old gray mule's flank. But her mind was far north of the barn, somewhere near a ridge she had never seen, beside a man who wanted nothing from her but her company. And for the first time in her life, she felt like maybe she could be something more than useful. Maybe she could be wanted. Maybe she already was. The mare Tobias brought for her was chestnut with a white blaze and a patient eye. He waited beside it, one hand resting on the saddle horn as Margaret stepped down from the porch in a borrowed riding skirt and the old boots that had belonged to Mrs. Donner's late cousin. They pinched her toes, but she didn't mention it. You ever ride before? He asked, adjusting the stirrup leather. Twice, on a mule. He bit me and walked backward down the hill. He chuckled low in his throat. This one's better mannered, name's Nettie. She's steady and slow, just like I promised. Margaret ran her palm down the mare's neck, careful and light. She's beautiful. She's yours for the day, he said. Think you're ready, she nodded, though her stomach fluttered. He offered his hand without a word, and she took it, using it to swing up into the saddle. The skirt pulled tight at her knees, but once seated, she settled more easily than she expected. Tobias mounted his own horse, a rangy bay with a scar above its right eye, and turned them west, toward the low hills that rolled beyond the cottonwoods. The sun hadn't burned off all the morning haze yet, and the air still smelled like dew and sweetgrass. They rode without hurry, the sound of hooves hushed by the soft dirt trail. He pointed out things as they went. A foxhole near a fallen pine, the blackened stump left from a lightning strike, a grouping of wild chokecherry bushes already heavy with fruit. When they reached the ridge, she pulled Nettie to a stop and stared. Below them, the land opened wide, green and gold with summer, broken by a ribbon of river that curled like thread through the valley floor. A hawk circled overhead, silent and sure. "I didn't know Montana could look like this," she whispered. "It's always looked like this," Tobias said. "Some folks just never get far enough to see it." They dismounted near a cluster of boulders warmed by the sun. He handed her a cloth bundle from his saddlebag, half a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, 2 boiled eggs, and dried apple slices wrapped in wax paper. She sat cross-legged on the flattest rock, her skirt gathered in her lap, and ate slowly, savoring the salt and the quiet. After they finished, she leaned back on her hands and closed her eyes. "I've never been anywhere that didn't have someone waiting to call me lazy or slow." He shifted beside her, brushing his fingers lightly across the rock's edge. "You're neither." "I know that now," she said, eyes still closed. A breeze lifted her hair off her neck. She felt him watching her, but he didn't speak again until she turned her head. "I used to think I'd end up alone," he said. "Not because I wanted to, just never fit easy into things." "What changed?" He looked at her then, the same way he had at the dance, like she was something found, not taken. "You, I think." She didn't answer for a long moment. Then she reached for his hand, not shy this time, and laced her fingers through his. "I want to make a life that doesn't feel like waiting," she said. "I want something that's mine." "You can have that," he said. "Not all at once, but we can build it." They rode back as the sun lowered, casting long shadows between the trees. The valley cooled and the crickets began to hum. She didn't want to return to the barn, but she didn't fear it either, not now. At the edge of town, he slowed his horse and turned to her. "Next Sunday, I'm coming back with a question." "I already know the answer," she said, her voice steady now. "But I'll let you ask it anyway." He smiled, not broadly, just enough. Then he reached out and touched her cheek with the back of his fingers, slow and careful, like he was still learning the shape of her. They parted at the Donner house, where she climbed down with her skirt dusty and her heart full. As she walked toward the barn, the cloth she'd hidden days ago pressed gently against her ribs beneath her bodice, a reminder that something new had begun, quiet and sure, just like the man who had handed her a dance instead of a judgment. The following Sunday broke warm and windless, the kind of day when the sky stretched pale blue and the birds kept low to the cottonwoods. Margaret stood by the pump behind the Donner house, rinsing the last of the flour from her hands. She'd risen early to knead the biscuit dough and stack the kindling before Mrs. Donner stirred. The woman hadn't spoken much since she'd seen Margaret disappear behind the mercantile with Tobias the week before, but she hadn't forbidden anything either. Margaret dried her hands on her skirt and walked around the side of the house, her heart steady and full. Tobias waited beneath the locust tree, reins loose in one hand, his hat pushed back on his brow. He wore a clean shirt, pale gray, with the sleeves rolled just to the elbows and a thin leather cord tied at his throat. "You're early," she said. "Didn't sleep much," he replied, gaze steady. "I kept going over what I wanted to say." She stepped closer, brushing a leaf from his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything special." "I want to, though." He hesitated, then offered a small, folded piece of paper. "I wrote it down just in case I forgot the words." She took it, her brow furrowing. "You wrote me something. Don't open it yet," he said. "Not till we get there." "Where's there? You'll see." They rode north, following a narrow trail that hugged the edge of the hills. The sun climbed slow, warming her back through the cotton blouse she'd sewn from the blue calico. It fit proper now, seams neat, sleeves rolled just like his. They didn't speak much, letting the rhythm of the horses fill the quiet. Eventually, the trail opened to a clearing tucked between two rock ridges. A stand of aspens swayed at the far end, their leaves flickering like coins. In the center stood a small cedar structure, simple, square, with a fresh tin roof and a sanded porch just wide enough for 2 chairs. She reined in, her voice low. "This wasn't here last week." "No," he said, dismounting. "Wasn't? You built it, started after we danced." "Finished the roof yesterday." He tied his horse to a post and turned to face her. "I figured if you wanted a life that was yours, you'd need a place to start it from." She slid down from Nettie's saddle, her boots crunching over dry grass. "You built this for me, for us," he corrected. "Only if you want that." He stepped up onto the porch and held out his hand. She joined him, fingers threading through his, then took the paper from her skirt pocket and unfolded it. The writing was careful, blocky, as though he'd taken his time shaping every letter. "I don't have silver or land in my name," she read aloud, voice trembling. "But I've got hands that build and a heart that stays put. If you want a home, I'll share mine. If you want a name, I'll share mine too." She lowered the paper, eyes wet. "I know folks might talk," he said. "But I'd rather live quiet and honest with you than loud and empty anywhere else." "I don't care what they say," she whispered. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a simple band of braided horsehair. "It's what I had," he said, "till I can get something better." She shook her head. "There's nothing better than something made by your own hands." He slipped it onto her finger, careful and steady, then pressed his forehead to hers. They stood like that a long while, the wind stirring the aspen, the porch warm beneath their feet. Later they sat on the edge with their boots touching. Tobias pointed toward the rise behind the cabin. "There's space enough for a garden come spring." "I'd like that," she said, "and a hen house." "I've never kept chickens, but I'd learn," he nodded. "We'll learn everything we need." She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder. "I never imagined a life that felt this quiet or this full." "You don't have to imagine anymore," he said. "It's yours now." She looked down at the ring, the strands woven tight like everything inside her that had once been scattered. "I was told I didn't belong, that I'd never be more than what I was born into." He turned his head, his lips brushing the edge of her temple. "They were wrong." Her smile came slow, but it stayed. Behind them, the cabin stood solid and still, a promise fixed to the earth. And this time there was no dance floor, no watching eyes, no borrowed shoes. Only 2 people, equal in the quiet, their hands joined in the space they'd made for each other. It rained the morning they married, a soft, steady rain that dampened the earth and quieted the sky. The preacher stood under the eaves of the small church on the north end of town, his black coat beaded with drops. Margaret wore a dress she'd sewn from unbleached cotton, plain but fitted to her frame with careful seams. Tobias had trimmed his beard and buttoned his collar all the way up. The same gray shirt he'd worn the day he gave her the horsehair ring now tucked beneath a dark vest borrowed from his neighbor. They said their vows with hands held tight and heads bowed. No crowd gathered, only the preacher's wife and an old rancher who'd offered to witness. The words were simple promises spoken low but meant. When it was done, Tobias didn't kiss her right away. He just looked at her with quiet certainty, like he'd waited half his life just to see her standing there. Later that afternoon, they rode west to the cabin while the rain lightened into mist. She carried a small bundle of salt, beans, and dried lavender given by the preacher's wife for blessing a new house, she'd said. Tobias had wrapped a flannel blanket around her legs while they rode, his hand steady at her waist. Inside the cabin, the hearth had already been laid with kindling, and he lit it while she unpacked the food he'd stored: cured pork, cornmeal, smoked trout, and a crock of honey. They ate by the fire, cross-legged on the floor, their backs resting against the wall. Outside, the rain softened to a hush. "I want to build a table," he said, tracing a finger across the floorboards. "Long enough for 6 chairs. She tilted her head. "Planning on company, planning on time," he said. "Years." She nodded once, then leaned into him. "I'd like to plant gooseberries along the south side. My mother used to boil them down with sugar and pour them over oat cakes. Then we'll do that come spring." She looked up at him. "I never thought I'd have someone to plan anything with. You do now." They slept that night on a straw mattress with wool blankets layered thick, his arm beneath her neck, her hand resting on his chest. The wind moved through the trees outside, but inside the walls stayed still and warm. In the dark, she listened to his breathing until hers matched it, steady and sure. By mid-autumn, the garden rows were marked with stones, the soil turned with a borrowed plow. Tobias had built 2 chairs for the porch and hung a small iron hook beside the door for her bonnet. Margaret stitched curtains from leftover muslin and lined the pantry shelves with beeswax paper. One afternoon, she sat mending a tear in Tobias's shirt while he fitted a yoke to a young ox in the paddock. A wagon rolled up the narrow track, its wheels squeaking. The Donners sat stiff on the seat, their expressions unreadable. Margaret stood, brushing her palms on her skirt, but she didn't move to meet them. She waited. Mrs. Donner climbed down first. "We brought something," she said, lifting a covered basket. "Didn't think it right to leave things how they were." Margaret stepped forward slowly. "What kind of something?" "Bread," Mrs. Donner said, "and pickled carrots, and a few jars of plum jam." Mr. Donner cleared his throat. "Figured you might need a start for winter." Tobias came from the paddock, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't speak, just stood beside Margaret with quiet ease. Mrs. Donner extended the basket. "You always worked hard." "Should have said that more." Margaret took the basket, her fingers brushing the worn handle. "Thank you," she said, her voice even. That evening she set the bread on a wooden plate and cut 2 thick slices. Tobias poured coffee and they ate in silence. When they finished, he reached across the table and ran his thumb along the edge of her wrist. "You all right?" She nodded. "They don't owe me anything, but it's good to let it go." Winter settled in slow and deep. Snow came early, covering the roof in soft layers. Tobias trapped rabbits and split wood, while Margaret kept the hearth burning and boiled stews heavy with root vegetables. They read by lantern light old pamphlets, worn almanacs, a book of poems Tobias had found in a second-hand crate. One night in late December, as the fire burned low, she turned to him. "I'm carrying." He looked up from the whittling knife in his hand, stilling. "You sure?" She nodded once. 5 weeks. He set the knife down. "You feel all right, tired?" "But good." He crossed the room and knelt before her, his hands resting lightly on her knees. "We'll make room, we'll make it good." She cupped his cheek. "You already have." In March, the thaw began. Geese passed low over the valley. The first sprouts pushed through the garden soil, and Tobias built a cradle from pine he shaped and sanded by hand. Margaret lined it with soft flannel and stitched a small bluebird onto the edge. They painted the door with whitewash when the weather held, and she planted a row of gooseberries by the porch. By midsummer, their daughter was born quiet, pink-skinned, with a strong grip and dark eyes that watched everything. They named her Alice after Tobias's mother. Margaret held her close while Tobias rocked them both in the porch chair he'd built. That night, with the baby asleep in the cradle and the fire crackling low, Margaret stood by the open window, looking out over the hills. Tobias came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "I never thought I'd live like this," she whispered. "I always hoped I would," he said. She turned in his arms. "You gave me more than a home. You gave me reason to build it." They kissed, slow and certain. The weight of all they'd endured settled now into something steady. Outside, the stars blinked through the dark like lanterns hung high. In the cabin they'd made with their own hands, with the child they'd brought into the world asleep between them, Margaret and Tobias lived out their days quiet and full, never grand, never loud, but always together. And always, always enough.